Welcome back, everyone. May I please request the F20 chairs, Neera Nandi, Klaus Milk, and Ilham Habibi to please join us on the stage and greet our friends from Indonesia.
Yes, hello, everybody.
Hello.
Greetings from New Delhi to Jakarta. Can you hear me?
Hi, Ilham. Yes, can you hear us?
Okay, but can you see me? I don't know. Don't know where to wave to. Maybe in the camera. No.
We
You see me
can
waving. There's a guy with a.
see us. We cannot see you. Yeah.
Oh, now we see.
We can imagine you waving though.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Just imagine.
But we can hear you loud and clear.
Okay. They don't have a means to see us here.
We saw
One of
you
the
a second
cameras should
ago. I
be-
think they'll try and fix it.
Yeah.
Okay. So what we're trying to do here, we have a parallel event between
And there you
Delhi
go.
and
We
Jakarta.
can.
At the same time, we have an event in Jakarta talking about similar topics in a library, which is actually the library of my late parents, which we use for certain events. And I don't know how many people are there, but there seems to be like 40 people or so.
Yeah, 40,
And,
50.
Yeah, 40, 50 people. And it is now in Jakarta, actually 1.5 hour difference. So they're actually ahead of time. Yeah. So it's almost 6 now, 5:45. That's why it's a bit darker in the back. There's actually a window. And so, yeah, just wanted to tell you guys, we are very happy to be connected and have a good discussion. We're having fabulous discussions here in New Delhi about climate and solutions, and basically talking about the so-called intersectionality, which is something new as a term that I learned today, but also about how to do this correctly regarding doing the right policies, and also having the Indian perspective on energy transition. I think it's all very learningful, and it's good to have this communication ongoing, because I think only if we communicate and cooperate with one another, we can solve these big problems. So back to you, Daniel, what is happening there?
Yeah, thanks, Ilham. Thanks for hosting us here. Thanks for giving us the library. We've already, while waiting for you to say hi, we've already started with some interesting statements from a few colleagues here. We have an amazing audience active, and they've also started contributing. And now we're ready to hear from you as well. I see some other important people next to you. Hi, Neera.
Yeah,
Hi, Klaus. So
I should give
I'm
maybe
happy to, we can say
yeah.
hi from Jakarta, and maybe
yeah,
can
I
hear
give
from you
maybe
as
the
well.
mic first to Klaus. Maybe you want to say something, and then later.
Of course. And greetings to Jakarta. It's wonderful to see you there in the house of Ilham's parents. And it reminds me so much what we did together last year. And the conference, the high-level event of F20 had the title Good Times. And that was very important to show up the optimistic people and foundations, organizations. Yes, we can do it. We must build up much more readiness, and we must speed up, and we must show to the heads of state of G20, we are part of the solution. And that was wonderful with the groupings in Jakarta, in Indonesia, and the startups. I learned a lot from Ilham, how important the young people and the startup community is. They can do a lot. Of course, also the big companies, and we had some here on the floor this afternoon, but I think the new ones, the innovative ones, are very important. So thank you there in Jakarta, and I hand over to my wonderful friend, Neera.
Thank you, Klaus and Ilham. Hello, everyone from Delhi, and I was reflecting on the good times session we had, and I must say it had like this amazing club music, and every time it'd be like and then they'd all come out, and it was full of a lot of energy, which just reminded me how important young people are in really, addressing this climate crisis, and that it actually hasn't come up as much today. The importance of that, I remember highlighting and speaking to the group, but also the importance of women in really transforming and addressing issues of climate. And it's at this intersectionality that both of them can play such an important role. I think what's really exciting is to see Indonesia and a friendship and be able to work together with India and see the South as a region that really addresses this together, perhaps in different sizes, but a lot of similarities. And it's really great that we can join forces. Maybe we can do more together. And thank you, Klaus and F20, for bringing us together, and greetings from a warm Delhi.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Neera. Thanks, everyone. We are going to stay silent, but listen in to you guys for a while. So thanks very much and happy to connect. All right.
Thank you, Neera, Klaus, and Ilham. For our final block today, One Earth, One Family, One Future, implementing sustainable development for people and planet, we will explore the particular role that philanthropy can play in these multilateral spaces. I am glad to hand over to my colleague, Akshay Shetty, who is a part of the Climate Rise team at Dasra, where he leads the organization's collaborative building efforts on climate action. Over to you, Akshay.
Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be moderating this very important panel discussion. Getting started with the panel discussion, we are speaking about climate philanthropy. Helen Mountford was here in the morning, and one of the most landmark reports that they did was around actually calculating what is the global giving to climate looking like. And it's 2%. We've been talking about that figure for too long. And Helen also added a footnote saying that how most of that funding is actually limited to mitigation. We are not even talking about looking at what adaptation funding looks like, or resilience and transition funding looks like. But it's fairly clear that there is a growing and gnawing need for philanthropies to actually step up and look at what the crisis is. And what the crisis really looks like is that the window of opportunity, the window that we have to actually being able to stave off the worst impacts of climate is actually narrowing day by day. And where is it that philanthropists can actually act and bridge that gap? What philanthropists also need to really understand is how the climate crisis is actually exacerbating so many of the societal challenges philanthropies have actually prioritized over the decades, be it education, healthcare, human rights, etc. So what does it take for philanthropy to actually understand what these gaps are? What are the opportunities right now? And what is the way forward? This is something we'll try and aim and understand through this panel discussion today. I want to first bring in Alice here on the panel. And Alice, also special to have you here because she'll be taking over as the co-chair of the F20 from here on. And Alice was also spearheading a very important movement at Wings as the philanthropy for climate movement there, really trying to rallying philanthropists around the question of climate action. So lovely to have you here, Alice. I wanted to understand from you, I think, to just setting context for this audience here as to what exactly, how do you really evaluate the climate philanthropic landscape today, and how does it need to move going forward? Over to you, Alice.
Thank you so much, Akshay. It's great to see you, many friends, and greetings to you all from Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. I hope to see you all in the forum next year here when Brazil takes over the G20 presidency. So I think, first of all, I wanted to say that I see the climate philanthropy landscape changing dramatically fast, in a sense. So I started working in climate philanthropy, I would say 7 years ago, more or less. And I'm really amazed to see how many new players are joining this space in the last 2 or 3 years, which is very good. It's positive news in a sense, even though we know the 2% figures, we know that this does not necessarily reflect the whole, what is exactly the investment of philanthropy in climate, because this is very much, as you just said, focused on mitigation. But the thing is, our understanding about what is the climate philanthropy role needs to improve much more. And there is a big gap, I would say, on the adaptation understanding, on the intersectionalities that we just described, and pretty much on how does other philanthropies that do not communicate in the same way or framing their approaches as a climate approach into this space, how can we welcome them into this. So the Philanthropy for Climate was a movement that does that, actually is a movement at Wings, but even ourselves now at X in Brazil, we are struggling, let's say, to make this, open those doors of the climate conversation to education funders, to health funders, to funders mostly working on public finance and other areas that we know that are so linked with what we need to see, the changes we need to see in the world. So I'm optimistic in one hand that this is changing, but I do think there is a huge behavioral change even amongst the climate philanthropies that needs to happen to speed up even more in the speed that we need to see.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Alice, for that. And want to be, I think it would be great for that, starting on that very, very optimistic note and setting us off with that. Arvind, I want to come to you next. AVPN has been looking at that question of climate philanthropy and also at the same time, interestingly, looking at it from that lens of intersectionality, trying to see how climate leaders can actually embed that into their giving as well. Could you talk to us a little bit about that, what that intersectional lens towards philanthropy looks like, and how is it that AVPN is trying to mainstream it in the sector?
Yeah, my own journey in climate has been fairly recent, and it has taken its turns to get to this. But after spending about 6 months into this, I realized that almost when we look at Asia, we say Asia, but there's this big India chunk, and then there's a China chunk, and then there's the rest of Asia chunk, and we are not even including West Asia in this, right? So first is climate is going to be a local issue for every country, right? It's a development priority, but also a political priority. So it's very important, therefore, that we engage with the local, leaders on this. So when we started, we then decided that we will build this community of philanthropic entities, funders, across different sources, across Asia, to then be able to say, can we bring their resources, but also their voice as local champions to then say, why is this important? And I think today we heard it so many times. It's in our self-interest, right? Even as India, to do this. So if we are able to push that local leadership in every place, I think that's the first thing. The second part is that, it's a commons issue, right? It's and I think the professor in the previous panel said it's a question of negative externalities. When we see commons, I think communities have been really good at handling commons for a long time and living in harmony. And I think right now, while it is important, we look at, humans at the center of this, we need to solve for the climate solution for all species, not just humans. We have been very good at decimating a lot of species, but as we look at solving this problem, can we look at all living parts, right? Including nature as part of this ecosystem. And if we want to do that, and we tried this when we set up this fund for sustainability last year, we in fact announced the grantees this year. 2 of them were from India. The idea was that there are local solutions, but those local solutions do not get the priorities. And oftentimes when we look at climate solutions, it's all getting imported, right? And this is already solved for, just take it and paste it. So that doesn't work. So can we have a role for philanthropy to play a role in spotlighting these solutions and institutionalizing them within the, the regional and the national framework of scaling and government system? So these are the kind of 2 ways in which we are tackling it, both from the philanthropic side, as well as from the nonprofit and the community organization side.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Arvind. I'll come to you, Yamit. Yamit, for many years, you've been a very important voice for climate justice within the philanthropic movement, and you're continuing to do that through your work as well. I wanted to understand from you, what does it take for the philanthropic movement, while it tackles the question of climate action, for it to prioritize the needs of the most vulnerable? How can we empower communities to better respond to emerging and future needs within the question of climate philanthropy?
Thank you very much. And I think my predecessors have alluded to a number of solutions and considerations. But I think, one of the things that is so complicated is the narrative on just transition itself. And the reason is because it's multiple and implies both trade-offs and huge opportunities. it's not just about energy, it's about reimagining, the social and environmental breakthroughs, the safeguards and inclusion across sectors and the value chain. And we know that climate finance for, climate action must be increased dramatically, not just within the next 7 years, but especially now, from the hundreds of millions to the billions, but actually more to the trillions that we need to see. So we need both, grants, but we need also more, and we know that, grants has its limits, and we need to find a way to bring the whole society into this, and especially the private sector, and to look at impact investments so that, we look more into the social dividends and not just, the profit. We need to look into blended finance structures where philanthropic organizations can participate in de-risking the role that they can play in such structure, by partnering with, donors that can bring some grants or the FIs, technical assistance, and then we can de-risk, we can look at, guarantees and then respond to the increasing interest that we see. And, over the past year, I was surprised to see that the increasing interest of asset managers, of, pension fund, that really realize that, they have to really take the issue of adaptation and resilience more seriously. And not just look at, the profit, making opportunities within the mitigation area. So, and this is why I think at the moment, we are really what we are investing on adaptation in particular, it's less than 50 billion per year when we know that we need, 400 billion by 2050, which is why we need to more than double. And this is what we came out of the climate negotiation. We need to more than double. And again, as Helen Montfort said, and also Alice earlier, the philanthropic organization, I think OSF is one of the few that decided to make it a priority, an area of priority. We need to see more philanthropic organization to invest into this. And if they do, to actually also double, not just leave governments to do that. And that requires taking risk. And again, less about profits, more about saving, not only saving lives, livelihood, but saving on the cost of the losses and damages that we would be facing. And the other dimension that has not been, mentioned yet is not just about quantity, it's also about quality. And where philanthropic organization can come in is how to make, the funding a little bit more predictable, not just year by year, as some of the treasuries, may be restricted upon, but, looking at multi-year grants, how to look at equitable access, and not just to governments, but to communities, and how to look at direct, in investment as well. And how it works with the mosaic of tools that needs to be deployed to reform the financial system. And therefore, how our support to de-risk, to support innovation can be also supported with ways to reduce debt distress. Because until we also, tackle that, we are going to still miss out opportunities for countries to go to the next level. And we need to build from the leadership, actually from the small, from those vulnerable nation communities that have solutions. It doesn't just come from the north. It doesn't come just from the usual suspect. And we see that leadership conveyed, by those calling out, the frauds of the system, like, Prime Minister Mia Mottley, or the V20 group with their Accra to Marrakesh roadmap. So I want to leave you with that positive notes. It's us with a number of stakeholders to look at the mobilization, how we can be creative with creative structures to mobilize together, but also to really be careful about the quality of it, and to really make sure it is accessible, equitably accessible. It is also trustworthy. We know what is counted as climate finance. and yes, and empowering with the social dividends that we know can actually also not only save lives, but save money at the end of the day. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Yami. That was wonderful. I'll now come to Shloka. Shloka, as ICC was one of the first institutions in India to really pioneer the question of climate philanthropy within India, actually mobilizing leaders, organizations to actually start intentionally thinking about giving towards climate action. Now that you're a few years down into the journey of also building ICC, how do you critically evaluate the landscape on climate giving in India? What are the gaps according to you? What do you think is the way forward?
Thanks, Akshay, and thanks for inviting us to be part of, honestly, a really important panel and event that, Dasra and F20 have put together today. Look, India is really interesting, to say the least. Like, we just went through the results of the Yale Climate Communication Survey for 2022. And what they discovered is pretty fascinating. 74% of Indians that they surveyed said that they've experienced the effects of global warming, which is, I think, about 24 percentage points up since 2011 when they last did the survey. They found 81% of people in India actually worried about global warming, and 50% of that are very worried. And 49% of people in India actually think they're already being harmed by global warming. So I think given sort of the deep perception around climate change and the fact that we understand that, we're sort of front and center or on the front lines when it comes to climate, the effects of climate rather in India, it's interesting that yet we're still yet to see that kind of funding, match that level of concern within the philanthropic sector. So I know Helen Mountford, of course, quoted that very famous statistic from Climate Works Foundation that less than 2% of global philanthropic giving is actually dedicated to climate change mitigation. You're right, we don't actually know the figures around adaptation or resilience, but I would say that there is also a lack of an analogous India-specific figure, which only serves to highlight the lack of focus on the sector domestically. So that is another sort of piece of the problem or something that needs to drastically change. I think in India, when we started 5 years ago, philanthropic funding around climate action was very low. It was a tiny fraction of the total philanthropic funding in the country, and there were reasons for that. The climate movement definitely lacked the overall support and involvement of Indian philanthropy. Efforts on climate change were uncoordinated. Individual philanthropies were at very different places in their climate journey. Learnings were unevenly distributed. When you said climate change and I said climate change, they often meant very different things. There was no common taxonomy or baseline of understanding around what it meant to fund climate in India. I think that is a current positive growth within the philanthropic landscape around giving for climate. You have organizations like Rain Matter Foundation or the upcoming Grow for Climate Fund by Edelgive Foundation. All of these are looking to make significant contributions within the ecosystem. There is also growing recognition amongst philanthropic leaders that climate action is actually critical for India's development. But as I said at the start, there is need for more funding. There has been an increase in donations to sustainability and, of course, within that climate, but the total giving in this sector is really, really low compared to overall giving in the country. And we know, and I'll end with this, but we know that philanthropy is a catalyst for additional finance. So we know that philanthropy alone will not fill the climate finance deficit, but it can play a really, really catalytic role in mobilizing additional finance from the public and private sectors. So, that is one of the most significant levers to, direct more action towards climate efforts within the country, finance as a lever. So we need more increased investment, and philanthropy can play a really catalytic role in leveraging more funds towards climate action in India. So I'll pause here, but happy to chime in later.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Shloka. Over to you, Rob. You've been up to something exciting at the World Economic Forum, where you've been working towards building the Giving to Amplify Earth Action initiative to harness public, private, and philanthropic partnerships to catalyze equitable climate and nature-positive solutions. Could you tell us more about the initiative and why does that give you hope?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for inviting me. It's always hard to follow such an excellent lineup of speakers. I sort of, as each panelist weighed in, I was just striking through speaking points that I had written down in preparation. But no, I think much of it has already been said. I particularly liked Charlokka's point where she just ended on about the catalytic potential of philanthropic capital and unlocking public and private financing. And I think this is where the new initiative that the World Economic Forum launched earlier this year, with consultation of many sort of friends in Delhi and Jakarta, but also the panelists on the line, seeks to sort of zero in on that sweet spot. What can we do if we raise that figure? That 2% figure has now been mentioned a lot. It's just climate mitigation. We don't know about adaptation. We also don't know much about what goes to nature protection or restoration. But if we manage to up that figure, can we give the philanthropies the confidence they need to make sure that whatever they deploy has the most catalytic impact? So the Giving to Amplify Earth Action Initiative, Gaia, which is the Latin spelling of Gaia that probably others on this call are more familiar with, that is exactly what this initiative is trying to do. So we're working with our traditional sort of partner base at the World Economic Forum, which is, of course, our membership companies that want to lead in this space, governments, and then a growing number of philanthropies that see how they can leverage their philanthropic capital to unlock this public and private financing. So we now have about 50 plus partners in this growing Gaia community. But yeah, to the point earlier, it's all about unlocking or using that very rare capital that philanthropy can deploy. You know, it's much more risk tolerant, it's much more nimble, it's much more flexible, to use that in a way that unlocks the, as Yamida said, the billions, the trillions that are needed to fund the net zero transition and, of course, the nature positive agenda.
Thank you so much, Rob, for that, and all best wishes for that initiative. It was really wonderful to moderate this and also to go beyond that 2% and actually talk about what is in the realm of possibility. And I think that's the kind of positive framing and the positive narrative that climate philanthropy globally and in India needs. Thank you so much once again to all the all the panelists here. It was wonderful to have you join us. And thank you, Arvind, for making it to Delhi for the event. Thank you.
Thank you, Akshay, and all other speakers. This was truly a fascinating panel. So good to hear from countries like Brazil as well. Before we move to the final panel of the day, may I please invite Stefan Schurig, the Secretary General of the Foundations 20 platform.
Thank you very much for having me. And I think I've already learned really great deal today about role of philanthropy, again, the different thoughts that we've been hearing today, and about you know, how we tax emissions, how we treat emissions, and so on and so forth. And when we orchestrate jointly with our partners the agenda, we felt one question is still missing, though. And Alice referred to that question on how exactly would this look like if we would tax carbon, for example? How would this translate into how do we generate megawatts in the Zukunft, in the future, and gigawatts? And before asking Sven to do a presentation with a lot of slides that are always a little bit hard to digest at an event like this, I thought we just make it a bilateral conversation and let others participate in this conversation. And Sven, great that you make it, and welcome from Sydney here in Delhi. The question really is, can we actually make it? So how does it actually look like? Provided we would actually really put a tax on carbon, provided we would really sort of make emissions way more expensive so that renewables would get even cheaper. Can we actually get to a renewable world that would be powered by renewables? Is that actually possible? Before we go into the details, what this would be in terms of targets for the different countries. I know that you've been looking a lot into these questions, and you've been advising, I think, 12 or 14 business sectors in their carbon budgets. But the question is, can we make it, and by when?
Yes, thanks for having me. Yes, we can make it. And I think we have to go through a few steps in order to make it clearer how do we actually get there. The very first step is basically to see what kind of renewable energy potential do we have in the specific country. And we focus on the analysis of solar and wind potential. And we have done it for the G20 country last year, together with F20, and we were actually surprised how large the potential is. So we basically need only a fraction of that potential for solar and wind under space-constrained condition in all the G20 countries in order to actually implement or generate enough energy, not just electricity, energy. The second step is we look at the available technologies, and we see that on the generation side, we are very well positioned to implement the technology today. In fact, we are already doing it, as if we look not only at the power sector, 89% of all new power plants built worldwide last year were actually renewables, mainly solar and wind. The reason for that is, A, it's the cheapest option. B, it's the fastest option to actually build, and it is independent from fuel, which means from fuel prices, and that means it gives some independence of specific countries, so they can actually have their energy supply based on the local market.
And when you refer to those figures, you're not just looking at solar radiation and wind abundance that exist in particular countries, but you're looking into the technological environment, you're looking to grid status, you're looking to the availability of materials. So there is a couple of things factored in when you come to that conclusion by when which shares of renewables would be possible, right?
Yes, I mean, we in the study last year, we did a projection, how much renewables do we need for each of the G20 countries. On average, we need to arrive at around 60% renewables, primary energy by 2030, which is a doable, even though it's an ambitious, but a doable thing.
Sorry, 60% primary energy, which means heat and electricity.
And transport,
yes. 60% by 2030, so that would be possible.
It is possible, and if we see at the trajectory, we basically double the solar market almost every year now. Wind market grows very steady and very stable. But what we also do is we look on the demand side, and we have an analysis right now in the making, which we will also publish just before the G20 meeting in Delhi by the end of August, early September, where we actually have a very detailed analysis into the steel sector, into the aluminium sector, chemical industry, transport, 16 different sectors, where we actually did a bottom-up approach in terms of first, what kind of energy demand is there in electricity, process heat, and so on. And on the other side, what can we actually build up, how fast? And what we also do in country analysis is an hourly simulation. So we actually see that demand and supply is always there and not just in theory over the year.
So I know it's not your expertise, at least not your core expertise, but I need to ask you that question. And I know you've been sort of really surveyed in terms of your analysis like 20 years back, when you said this and this would be possible under this and this circumstances. And this survey really looked into a couple of other studies that did the same sort of road mapping or scenarios, and you turned out to be the most accurate one. So I guess you know what actually really happens and what is possible. So the question to you is, if that is technical possible, 60%, what is the most relevant rate limiting factor? What is holding us back from your view? And I know you're a scientist, you're not entitled to say, well, it may be this or that, but you're focusing on facts. But still, I need to ask you that question.
I think is the incumbent sort of actors in the market. When you have a power plant or infrastructure which is not written off, you want to keep it going and you want to earn money with it. And so the problem is that we have an existing infrastructure which is still not written off, which is still profitable and does not need any replacement. Then we don't even think about building something new because we have the infrastructure. So right now, replacing existing infrastructure is probably the main obstacle. Good example here in Australia, our coal power plants on average almost 40 years old. So we have to build new power plants anyway. And we, with a new government in place now, almost exactly 12 months, we accelerate the renewable implementation so fast that we are probably at around 80% renewable electricity by 2030 already. So we accelerate very fast. Technically, from the logistical side, but also from the economic side, an upscaling is possible and is actually in the making. If we look at the current expansion rates of especially solar photovoltaics and wind, which will take over a huge amount of energy production because we have also a lot of electrification in the heating, cooling sector and transport sector. So electricity will be sort of the next primary energy almost.
Okay, well, I think we only have been given sort of a very short time frame to discuss this. Many thanks again, Sven, for being with us and for taking the time. I know that everyone wants to talk to you at these days because we are currently discussing a global renewable energy target, and it will be subject of the COP in Dubai, and it is subject of many, many conversations at the moment. Can we actually have a global renewable energy target? What we from F20 did, we sort of really roadmapped a renewable electricity target with your support, Sven, because you were actually writing this report and did the number crunching, how such a target would look like for the group of the G20. And we ended up in saying that a 70% renewable electricity target by 2030, that would translate from the 60% primary energy, that would also include transport, is actually possible. And that's what is also on top of our recommendations. And I'm glad to hear that global governance is really now looking into such a target. So good luck for all your work in the next weeks and months. And really, again, many thanks for taking your time, and warm regards, indeed, warm regards from Delhi to Sydney. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And with this, I'm heading back to you, Kirti.
Thank you, Sven and Stefan, for this quick but enriching conversation. Continuing our focus on the potential of renewables, I have the pleasure to welcome Dr. Ram Babu, who has been a thought leader in the Asian sustainability and climate change movement and has served as the managing director at Cantor CO2e Asia and the head of sustainability and climate change practice in Asia at PricewaterhouseCoopers. Over to you, Dr. Ram Babu.
I think after the global perspective that the previous speaker has given, you engaged him. Yeah, you engaged him also quite closely and intricately. I just want to, in parallel, I want to present the Indian scenario. What is happening in India vis-a-vis the renewable energy target and renewable electricity target, and how are we progressing? And my company, Greenko, of which I'm the sustainability officer, what are we doing and what are we actioning? Okay. So my the discussion and deliberation here has been quite broad. It was addressing the climate action both in mitigation and adaptation. And there have been, in the previous panels, there have been discussions as to how to raise the climate philanthropy, addressing and increase the climate philanthropy towards the adaptation. Our focus at Greenko, and also my colleagues in other companies who are looking at it, we are quite keen in accelerating the mitigation so that the challenge of adaptation is minimal, as much as we can minimize it. So we would like to achieve really achieve the net zero, global net zero by 2050. And if it is possible, and make it happen even in countries like India and many other developing countries. So that is our focus essentially. While we accelerate the journey towards the net zero, it is not that the whole industry is interested in accelerating the journey towards the net zero. Slower movement, transition to net zero, is in the interests of multiple sectors of the industry. And accelerating the transition is in the interest of some sections of the industry. So there is always this tussle between these two sectors and at the policy making, at public policy discourses, etc., etc. And that is one reason why I want many of you also to focus on accelerating the mitigation in such a way that the adaptation requirements 100% are going to be there, because already the global warming is happening and the temperature rise is already there. Climate impacts we are already seeing. So it is very, very important to accelerate the mitigation so that the adaptation requirements are not very high. Now coming to India, you all know that the India's renewable story is a very interesting story and also exciting story. So we did come out with a good, some of the important factors about India is that in India, the renewable capacity, installed capacity is significantly high. It is almost touching 50% of the capacity, total installed capacity, not in terms of power generation, but in terms of capacity. So it's a significantly high renewable electricity generation capacity. And the cost of generation is also not very high. And India has very, very interesting thing is that it has one of the best integrated national grid. So there is a possibility of generating renewable electricity wherever such resources are very high and transmitting it to a place where the demand is there. So because of the integrated national grid, very significantly good national grid, robust national grid, our challenges are simpler in terms of scaling up the renewables. But what kind of scaling up of renewables that we are looking at? See, the present electricity needs, if they continue and if I do simple business as usual growth pattern, then the installed capacity of 400 gigawatt by 2050 may have to almost reach something like 1,000 gigawatt. But if I look at electrification of various applications of energy, for example, I want to electrify mobility. As the professor was speaking, that I want to decarbonize the steel industry. Hence, I want to supply to the steel industry the hydrogen. And how do I produce the hydrogen? I would produce the hydrogen by splitting water using the renewable electricity. If I want to do decarbonize not only the electricity sector, but I also want to decarbonize the energy sector, and then I want to decarbonize the material sector, chemical sector, etc. I think my requirement of electricity generation in India is going to be significantly high. And the kind of estimates that we were looking at are stupendous, actually. It is almost like going to something like a 2,000 gigawatt number or more. Okay, from the plans that the India has on the hydrogen production and green fuel, electric green fuel production, etc., and electric green chemicals production, etc., we see that the demand for electricity is going to be very, very high. In India, even today, a pure renewable is a bigger challenge because it cannot get integrated into the grid. Because renewables are variable, whereas demand is at another time, right? And that is the reason why a significant amount of storage is required. Unlike in the European grid, where you have flexible sources of generation of energy, which is gas, okay, India has either renewables or it has coal. Both are inflexible. Actually, renewables are variable and coal is completely inflexible. It will keep generating the power all the time. And because we wanted to accommodate renewables into the grid and want to take that as a first priority, whenever it generates, I want to take it and pay for it. The coal generation has been always asked to back down. Hence, most of our coal plants today are not actually operating economically efficiently. And because of that, majority of them are becoming unviable, one after the other. So it is extremely important in India, considering that we have a very good national grid, a gigawatt scale storage capacities have to be built. And India is building that. India has not only renewable obligations by various electricity users, but also it has storage obligation. So India has a significant focus on electricity storage. The moment I have an electricity storage, then I have the renewable electricity. I have now ability to provide dispatchable 24/7 renewable electricity. The moment I have ability to do 24/7 dispatchable renewable electricity, and we are understanding in India, today we will be able to supply a 24/7 dispatchable electricity at a cost lesser than a new coal-based power plant generation. So there is no economic or economic, I don't know, but there is no financial reason why a new coal-based power plant in India should come up for generating electricity. Today, we can supply whatever coal can do, and in a much more flexible way, one can supply renewable electricity with pumped hydro storage at a cost. We can supply the electricity which is dispatchable at a cost comparable to or less than a new coal-based power plant. And once that capability is there in India, then immediately what is going to happen is that the electrolyzers which split water to produce green hydrogen now can be alkaline electrolyzers, which are in capital wise cheaper, and their operating costs are also lower. Hence, India seems to be having an architecture of generating or producing green hydrogen at one of the lower costs. So because of this, okay, the overall situation where you have an integrated grid at a national level and ability to produce a green electricity, 24/7 green electricity, firm electricity at a cost comparable to the thermal electricity. And then you have an architecture to use the alkaline electrolyzers to generate green hydrogen, and then on green fuels and green chemicals, etc. The path forward for scaling up renewables seem to be better than many other geographies that we have seen across the world. But of course, there will be challenges, okay, because of the integrated grid and storage capacities, we are solving the grid problem, but there are problems with regard to solar. What kind of a technology upgradations are going to be there? How to deal with the solar panels or the wind permanent magnets at the end of the life cycle, and how to procure the materials that are required to make the solar panels. The supply chain problems are going to be there, and that challenges have to be resolved. And as the technology advances, the access to the new technologies, new materials, and sorting out the problems of the end of the life, I think these challenges are going to be there in the scaling up. But we at the industry level and at the government level, we see a positive vibe that the scaling of renewable electricity generation and renewable energy generation seem to be, India is thinking it's actually an opportunity, and once in a while India's time. That is how it is looking at. The moment it has become oil and gas, the moment it is coal, India had a disadvantage vis-a-vis energy. And with the solar, wind, and scaling up of renewables, India sees that disadvantage is at least overcome. And that is the reason why Prime Minister talked about by 2047, 100th year of India's independence, we will be targeting energy independence in India. That means we will be importing significantly less amount of energy than what we are importing today. So on a positive note, I'll leave it to you. In India, at least, we believe that the scaling up of renewables have lesser obstacles than in some other geographies immediately. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rambabu. Our last keynote before we close is from somebody who does not need an introduction in the area of sustainable finance. Dr. Simon Zadek was head secretariat at UN Secretary General's Task Force on Digital Financing of the Sustainable Development Goals, senior advisor on finance in the Office of UN Secretary General, and co-director at United Nations Environment Programme's Finance Inquiry. Today, he serves as the executive director of Nature Finance. Dr. Zadek, the floor is yours now.
Thank you very much indeed. Just checking that you can hear me okay. Yep, that sounds good. I see somebody waving. So thank you very much. And I've had the pleasure to sit in on the last couple of sessions. Absolutely fascinating. Lots to learn. And I'm going to contribute a slightly different part of the story. I was asked to spend a few minutes talking about the so-called billions to trillions challenge. How do we raise a whole lot of money? And of course, all of the preceding conversations about optimizing technology deployment all need that money. And we heard a little bit from the World Economic Forum colleague and others how some of the private public collaborative platforms are being developed. I'd like you to sort of mentally reframe the question I've been asked, not how do we get from billions to trillions, but how do we get the trillions that are already there to be channeled in the right way? Now it's easy to throw out big numbers, so I won't spend too long on it, but just to illustrate the point, global financial and capital markets manage today about 500 trillion US dollars. Public expenditure globally is more or less $25 trillion, so about 25% of annual global GDP. Aggregate domestic savings across the world today are 23 trillion, with a growing percentage of that not being in OECD countries, but being in India, China, Russia, South Africa, and elsewhere. And $90 trillion course their way through global sovereign debt markets. So the principal mechanism by which countries across the world, not every country, finances themselves, both in the short and often in the longer term. And so our challenge arguably is not how to raise money, but how to get that money to go somewhere else as compared to where it is today. And I want to just sort of come down from the abstract big numbers and spend just a few minutes giving some practical examples, each of which is intended to both point to large pools of money and mechanisms for redirecting them, but also by implication, this being the F20, points to potential roles for the philanthropic community to support innovation, advocacy, and market development in each of these areas. I'm going to start with sovereign debt markets. Many of you will have come across green bonds. In fact, India has a large one of its own. It's called a use of proceeds bond. You say we're going to spend this money on X, you raise the money, and then you spend the money on X. And actually, it turns out it doesn't really save India much money. In fact, if anything, it costs India more money because of the costs of having to monitor and manage the commitments that have been made. But we see a new generation of sustainability-linked sovereign debt bonds that in return for performance outcomes deliver reductions in debt service payments, which of course is important for every country, but is particularly important for the 60 sovereign countries, particularly across the sub-Saharan African region, who are in debt or extreme debt distress, and therefore also have food insecurity problems as we speak today. So Uruguay and Chile have launched sustainability-linked sovereign debt instruments that reduces the cost of servicing that debt in return for, in the case of Chile, in fact, renewables kilowatt hour output targets being reached. In the case of Uruguay, both renewable energy and demonstration of standing forests being retained, so a biodiversity goal as well as a carbon sequestration goal. Barbados, Belize have refinanced their entire sovereign debt stock, brought down significantly the cost of servicing debt, in return for agreeing in each of those cases to investments in coastal protection, particularly coral reef protection, that for both of those countries, given where they are geographically, is critical to their long-term survival and prosperity. And we see most recently Ecuador announcing a $1.2 billion bond linked to investments in the Galapagos, in return for which there is a reduction in debt servicing costs. Who pays for those debt servicing cost reductions? Of course, therein lies the trick. Yeah, and a combination of international public finance combined with insurance products, and indeed combined with philanthropic actors that have together designed and developed these instruments and deployed them and are increasingly deploying them at scale. Large market for public capital, sovereign debt, aligning it more effectively to sustainability outcomes, without doubt, a kind of double benefit, particularly at a time of extreme debt distress. I wanted to touch on the very contentious topic of voluntary carbon markets, which, as many of you will know, have gone through a period of hubris and have now, through various scandals, have to some extent fallen into neglect, or perhaps more appropriately, despair. Today, their global value is only $2 billion, really rather meager compared to the scale of carbon that could be offset and the investment flows that could support, for example, the very renewable energy investments that we've just been hearing about over the last few minutes. They failed for a whole range of different reasons, but certainly one of them is what I would refer to as the price gradient. That a carbon credit bought in Oaxaca, a central Mexican rural state, might typically sell for $10, and that same carbon credit would then be flipped in Brussels or elsewhere in Europe or the States for $100 or more. These sorts of inequalities in the way in which carbon and now also biodiversity credit markets have functioned so far clearly don't allow for those markets either to be fair by any measure at all, or also simply to grow because of the gross inequities and, of course, the inadequate finances that flow to the project developers that need, in the case of nature-based solutions, to actually sustain those nature assets in order to ensure that that carbon sequestration actually happens. Role for philanthropists actually very significant. We need to develop a new generation of voluntary carbon markets. We're beginning to see now a next generation of different kinds of broader biodiversity credit markets evolving. Many philanthropists already engaged in piloting, in building approaches to build governance that will be more effective, engaging with indigenous peoples in different parts of the world and local communities to find ways in which they can support and be part of the way in which those markets work in the future. And then the last example is really in the tech area, but it's not so much in the energy tech area as in the digital tech area. And that kind introduction that was given a couple of minutes ago referred to my role in running for the UN Secretary General a high-level task force on digital financing of the SDGs. And I learned a lot, and we've begun to see in particular how a combination of classical mobile payment tools, which many of you in the room and many of those in India and elsewhere already have, linked to blockchain, tokenization, and other parts of this emerging data ecosystem, can begin to not simply allow payments to be made in a more effective way, but begin to mobilize significant amounts of domestic savings targeted at specific and attractive infrastructure projects. Imagine a taxi driver in Delhi with his or her mobile device having to place their savings somewhere, however meager it might be. Imagine that they have a choice, that they could put it into an asset class that invests in a hospital that their mother goes to, a school that their daughter goes to, or a bridge that he or she has to cross every day. Yeah, at that point, you've actually got a citizen-based investment model mobilizing potentially large amounts of capital in domestic currency that is not so reliant on the vagaries and complications of accessing international capital markets, which of course, as we've seen most recently, is very tricky. So in conclusion, thank you for the time. I think the story I would conclude with is really quite simple. First, yes, we have to raise money to do all sorts of things. That's, if you like, the vernacular. But actually, the reality is that the scaled opportunity is not more mobilization, but greater redeployment of existing financial flows. There are multiple markets, tools, and mechanisms for doing that. And I've given you a couple of examples, in fact, 3, as to ones that are actively being worked on at scale. And in each and every case, there is a role for philanthropists to play a really important part in bringing actors together, mobilizing their capabilities, promoting innovation, active market development, supporting enabling policy and regulation, and really pushing that money from where it is right now, which may be unproductive or indeed counterproductive, into areas that are more productively aligned to sustainable development outcomes. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Dr. Zadek. We are now coming to the close of the event. As many of you know, the Foundation's platform F20 develops policy recommendations for every G20 presidency, and this is the first time when they're publicly announced. Stefan, may I please welcome you back on the stage to take it from here?
Thank you very much, Kirti. And also, I promise to be very brief. What is the G20? How does the G20 matter anyway? And what it is, it really creates a momentum in the country. You can see that when you drive down the roads, you see the G20 posters literally everywhere. So it's a big opportunity for a government sort of to create a momentum, to host the biggest nations in the particular country. And it also provides momentum, of course, for many organizations to work on particular subjects and global challenges, as we've been doing this today. It's also a very important reference because you can hold G20 countries in that sense accountable, or at least you can reference to their decisions made in previous years and the year before and so on. And can I have maybe the presentation so that I can just run you briefly through the list of recommendations that we as F20 developed jointly with the steering group, with a lot of technical and economical advice. And that is, of course, tailored a little bit to the language that has been deployed in the context of the G20. Do I think that the Prime Minister sits down to read our list of recommendations first before he takes action? It doesn't work that way, let me say it this way. But many organizations develop these kind of thinking and positioning about the G20 and what the G20 countries and what particular members of the G20 countries should do. And what we do now is that the offices of the Sherpas read those recommendations, and that the different engagement group refer to it, we refer to their recommendations. So therefore, yes, again, it is a reference. It is a document of reference points to be made to many of the aspects that we've been discussing. Don't be scared and I'm not going to through all these various aspects that we've been covering, but the general spirit of this year's recommendation has the point of departure with this mission lifestyle of President Modi, and the point of saying, listen, we are 20 countries in this group, but we have very different point of departure when it comes to the economic powers, when it comes to the per capita emissions. So lifestyle for environment also means that there are historic burdens of the G7 countries that need to be taken into account, and we really understand that, and we have taken that into account for our list of recommendations. And what we always do is we also try to refer the recommendations in the context of previous years. So people, planet, prosperity, the motto of Italy last year, or recover together, recover stronger from Indonesia last year, and Italy in 2021, and then One Earth, One Family, One Future this year. There's a close commonality between those different approaches. And in this document, we are trying to refer to this. Can I get the next slide, please? So we are looking into the promises made by the G20 countries and then referring to these promises and building our recommendations to the next point. Next slide, please. The political developments, of course, need to be taken into account when we develop those recommendations. And there have been a couple of really positive developments. We've heard about the rise of renewable energy. We've heard about end plastic pollution decision, about the decision to establish a loss and damage fund, the positive results of the biodiversity conference, and of course of the High Seas Treaty. This needs to be taken into account. So we are of course trying to understand the political environment and then conclude from that. Next slide, please. Thank you. And then we sort of summarize the list of some briefly 25 or 30 recommendations to basically 6 overall recommendations, or 7 overall recommendations. And one of the key recommendations really is what we've also been discussing today. We need concrete targets by the governments, commitments by the governments, and measurable targets. And that's why we have been really doing the number crunching and saying 70% renewable electricity by 2030 would be possible. Also in terms of the technology issues, the storage issues that we've been hearing. So this is something that we recommend to the heads of state to commit to. The next one is the establishment of new energy partnerships. We've heard from Ilham also in the kickoff of this day that the Just Energy Transition Partnership decided in Indonesia is now taking shape. And we strongly recommend that we follow that road of really multilateral energy partnerships. And we may probably also seek a commitment from India to, for example, join the climate club that has been now discussed in the context of the G20. Then the third sector covers issues on sustainable finance, and it's very simple: decarbonize the finance sector, use the money in the right way so that we have actually a chance to really remain under the 1.5 degrees benchmark. The fourth part is really recalling the global net zero target and phasing out those energy types that really keep emitting emissions. So a couple of issues raised there. Then really taking mission life seriously, mission lifestyle seriously, and we are suggesting to establish a task force that would really look into the mission life, how this idea of Prime Minister Modi on life could actually be implemented also in the next years when we look to Brazil. And then it's a very important point, and we've been discussing this also in the session this morning, on resilience, on adapting to changes and impacts we can't actually avoid anymore, how to increase community resilience. We've got a couple of recommendations there that are highlighting those particular perspectives from the communities, from the local areas, from the cities, when it comes to the climate emergency, let's say. And the last point is on looking at ourselves, looking on philanthropy and what we can do. And we've heard about the last panel, what philanthropy can do. Maybe the last slide, please. So we've listed a couple of points that we as philanthropy think we can do, we can bring to the table, we commit to. And we also list this in the list of recommendations, basically also saying to the G20 heads of state that we know the responsibility, we are aware about the responsibility that philanthropy has. Now, can we get to the next slide, please? Please feel free to download those recommendations, read them carefully, share them, and then I can take us to the next slide. This is, of course, our network. And then the next slide, please. And that is the part that Kirti has said in the very beginning. And you may have heard that. She said, we end the session with a surprise. And now is the moment when I want to start this or sort of share this little surprise for you, because we have now 7 years with F20 when we started back in 2017. And we've had a long discussion over the last months to reshape the organizations, further strengthen the organization of F20 to really, you know, because it's becoming a really relevant network now. In this process, my dear friend Klaus, you've decided to step down as chair, remain committed with F20, you remain in the steering group, but this may be the last Climate Solutions Forum in your role as a chair. And I wouldn't want to miss the chance to then also tell you very personally that it's been a very exciting journey. It's been a fantastic journey. I think we've done like 50 events together. We've done a couple of sort of scientific research together, but more importantly, I think we've helped a little bit to to seed sort of climate updates within the philanthropy world, let's say. And I think this is really a great achievement, not to speak about all these political commitments that you got through your leadership and through your passion that you bring to the table. And everyone who knows you knows exactly what I mean. So a very, very big thank you. And I ask you to join me on the stage just for 1 minute, because it's not just warm words. We also have flowers for you, my dear Klaus. And we have prepared a 2 minutes video for you that just summarizes a little bit all these exciting points and aspects of the journey of F20. So my dear friend Klaus, in your role as chair. Thank you. Thank you. And we move on. Yes. So maybe we can have the little video, and you feel free to sit down again so that you can see it. So this is first image we saw was from last year with Jenny Wahi. This is from the first years in Hamburg, and in the next years then with our partners in Italy, which was one of the following years then in the G20 sort of series. And here we are in Milano for our event, still dealing with the impacts of a pandemic, which also was part of that journey, not to mention that, and switching from on-site formats to online formats and dealing with all that was also quite a journey. And what you've always been able to do is you've always been sort of achieving to bring together high-level politicians. If you look at the image from Hamburg, then you see really former ministers, future ministers, chancellors, and so on. And you bring together also people from communities and from the smaller organizations and foundations. You're always saying we don't just want only the giants, we also want the small ones. And that's exactly what you can see in all the work that we do. So thank you once again for all your work, Klaus.
Thank you, Stefan. Thank you for sharing the recommendations and also bringing back Klaus. It's not possible to summarize all the insights we've had from the discussion so far, so I won't even try. But before we close, I would like to welcome Norbert Gorisen, the Deputy Special Envoy for International Climate Action at the German Foreign Office. He's joining us live from Berlin today. Over to you, Norbert.
Thank you very much for the kind invitation. And thank you also, a very big thank you to Klaus. This was also a big surprise for me to hear that he's stepping down now. I've been working with Klaus also in the context of F20 for all these years, and I really appreciated working with him, and big congratulations for what has been achieved. And thank you also for the F20 recommendations regarding what we will need to achieve amongst the G20 in this year and with respect to COP28. To look a little bit at COP28 and explain to you what, in our view, is at stake and what the role of foundations could be there. The planet, I'm sure that you discussed that, is in an alarming state, threatened by rising temperatures, extreme weather events like heat waves and floodings, and the loss of precious ecosystems. Its consequences span the globe, affecting every country, from India to Germany, from islands to mountains, every community, and ultimately each and every one of us, but of course, particularly the most vulnerable communities and people. Foundations already do a lot, and they play an important role, but we think they can go further. They have the power to mobilize resources, catalyze innovation, drive transformative change, provide financial assistance, support research, develop clean technologies, and advocate for policies that accelerate the transition to a net zero economy and economies. Moreover, foundations have the ability to foster collaboration among different stakeholders. They can facilitate partnerships between governments, business, civil society organizations, bringing together diverse expertise and resources, creating platforms for dialogue and knowledge sharing. Foundation can encourage cooperation, build consensus, and amplify the impact of collective action. At COP28, the global stocktake is one of the main objectives and agenda items. The technical process of the global stocktake so far has already produced 170,000 pages of material. We are currently distilling. I'm here in Bonn at the moment to distill it down to the essential actions that we need to take in this decade and thereafter in all major systems of the society. These essentials must be reflected in the decisions taken at COP28 as an outcome of the global stocktake. We are very well aware that the global responsibility for GHG emissions rests on the shoulders of some major players in the global economy. In particular, to keep 1.5 in reach, the responsibility lies within the G20. But in order to access and make good use of them, the whole global community is active. Accepting planetary boundaries means placing the comprehensive reduction of GHG emissions at the very center of all our actions. What we are discussing at the moment, or what is at the discussion at the moment, are large-scale carbon management technologies. But we believe they still have insufficient scientific basis and technological maturity. They are expensive and they take time to really be applied. They also lack environmental safeguards and standards. So we have very clear limits and criteria for their use. And it would be risky simply to rely on these technologies. So therefore, the rapid phase out of all unabated fossil fuels is indispensable and must not be delayed by any other means. The massive expansion of renewables and energy efficiency facilitates low carbon development pathways, technological innovation and stimulates economic growth. This is why the German government and the European Union, jointly with its allies, advocates for the adoption of global targets for the expansion of renewable energies and energy efficiency at COP28. We also want an equitable and just transition. This means that we have to consider the needs and rights of all people, especially those who work and live in regions that are heavily dependent on fossil fuels. We need to find solutions that can provide them with alternative work opportunities and ensure social security. we can create infrastructure based on renewable energy while strengthening local communities and promoting their energy independence. This requires close collaboration between governments, business, unionists, academia, and civil society. And that's where foundations again come in. Foundations and philanthropy can help and develop and implement fair transition strategies with all those partners. In line with the F20 recommendations, the G20 should therefore broaden and deepen just energy transition partnerships and other multi-donor concepts. We also need policy frameworks that incentivize the transition of energy systems and ensure investments taken by the private sector and that the necessary policy professional skills are trained. Also, the development of aligned and green standards for products and novel energy sources will be key. The Climate Club, introduced by Germany, will work on this area, in particular in order to apply to support the development of the decarbonization of our industries. Crucially, additional funds are needed for these endeavors. The global impact of climate crisis varies widely. It's often those lacking of the financial supporters who bear the greatest burden of adaptation and mitigation, and now more and more loss and damage. While developed countries have committed to providing the 100 billion annually, a goal that we are confident to be met this year, according to our current projections, the provision of additional funds will be crucial to meet actual needs. The operationalization of funding arrangements for loss and damage, including defining a fund, is amongst another major milestone that needs to be complemented in short run and jointly with the phase out of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies this year. We rightly heard a lot of calls for reforms of the international financial institutions and to mobilize private finance at a much larger scale. Frameworks for de-risking private investment and supporting robust national frameworks and standards will further help making the country a more attractive location for investors, and vice versa also foster increased access to European and other markets. In conclusion, the challenges posed by climate change require global momentum, and the G20 climate and environmental negotiations are pivotal in this endeavor. By setting clear priorities, addressing the challenges, seizing the opportunities, giving clear guidance, and recognizing the role of foundations, we can make significant progress towards achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement. So I'm really thankful for all the work F20 foundations and philanthropies have done so far. Let's unite our efforts, collaborate across borders, and act with urgency, for it is only through collective action that we can secure a sustainable future for all. So thanks again for inviting me, and all the best for the future of F20, even without the same role of Klaus Mieke. But thanks, Klaus, for all your work you've done, and thank you for listening to me. Thank you.
Thank you, Norbert. We will now proceed for the closing remarks of the day from the head of the host and co-host of this year's Climate Solutions Forum. May we please have Neera, Klaus, and Vatsila Joseph on the stage.
We all don't want to go first. So I'll be very quick because I know it has been a long day, and thank you for staying. And I can't imagine in a few minutes we can actually capture all of the vibrant conversations that we've had today. I do want to take a moment, since I have the mic, to thank Klaus and Stefan for this amazing relationship that will continue despite your different roles that you will play, either in the F20 or in life, but also for all the friendship that we've started and that we may continue. And if Brazil, you're listening, we're coming over there. So let's keep bridge building, and let's really make this conversation into things that are actionable. And let's not forget the face of the most vulnerable, that all of this climate change actually burdens to an extreme sense. And if we can keep that at the forefront, then we can really use philanthropy to make a difference. But why don't I hand over to you?
So first of all, that was a surprise thrown by Stefan in terms of Klaus stepping down. And I was happy to see that picture of you with Krishan Dhawan
Yeah.
on
Shakti.
from Shakti. Yeah. So we actually the collaboration with Shakti started long time back, and that's something which we cherish as well. We've been talking a lot, and this is the first time we are meeting in person. So that's also a privilege to us. Thank you so much. So I would like to take this opportunity to appreciate the very strong representation of public, private, and philanthropic entities present here. I would also like to extend a warm welcome to Klaus, Ilham, Neera, and Norbert, of course, who was online. I look forward to using this meeting as a stepping stone to initiate a stronger framework of engagement going forward. I represent Shakti Sustainable Energy Foundation, which has been at the forefront of supporting the acceleration of climate and clean energy system interventions in India. Shakti is a trusted source for research and analysis on climate change and clean energy topics. There is a general perception that economic development and environmental sustainability are contradictory to each other. This is because the model of economic development that we have to understand comes with a high cost to the environment, especially climate change. This is the model that has been followed by the developed world and is based on excessively high consumption-based lifestyles linked with a high consumption of fossil fuels. At Shakti, we strongly welcome India's recent net zero pledge as an attempt to rationalize the contradiction between sustainability and growth. This pledge is not just a mitigation pledge, it is a fundamentally different economic development model from the one that the developed world has followed over the last 2 centuries. What India is trying to do is to decarbonize as we develop. I strongly feel that the development path India is now taking has no historical precedent or ready lessons that can be drawn from developed countries. India must carve out its own niche, become a harbinger of the new economic growth. Given India's ambitious development goals, be it Make in India or the Atmanirbhar Bharat or lifestyle, which is lifestyle for the environment life, to name a few, the task before us is cut out. Between now and 2047, the Prime Minister has outlined a development vision of Amrit Kal. The country's victories and triumphs will lead the way for the developing world, that's the global south, to pioneer pathways for sustainable economic progress. At this juncture, I must underline the need for augmenting policy research in India. The nation's development vision needs to be reinforced with strong policy support outcomes which can facilitate decision-making, especially for our states, guide stakeholders for driving investments at scale, and indeed develop sectoral actions vital to the transformative development India requires over the next 25 years. Our next 25 years are akin to post-independent India. Philanthropy can play an influential role in this transition. The philanthropic and civil society ecosystem needs to expand to keep pace with India's ambitious net zero emissions pledge, while also balancing the nation's rapidly growing development and energy needs. At today's convening, we engage with some of the finest brains in the country to support India's development agenda via trade and investment. Philanthropy at large needs to strive, build bridges and support policy innovation and market-based solutions. Shakti is certainly seeking to work as thought partner with all stakeholders, especially states and union territories, which are the principal agents for policy and market-based solutions fostering economic development. Before I conclude, I would like to express my heartfelt gratitude to all our partners and stakeholders, my team at Shakti. I'd like to take their names. Manu, if you can stand. Antara, Vedant, and Koel. Koel is not here, but he was there earlier in the day, for their support, encouragement, and efforts in putting together this elaborate convening successfully. Today's event promises well for philanthropic collaborations as we progress in our journey towards more expansive net zero horizons. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm not going to say much, only 3 things. So first of all, it was a whole lot of learning today for me, and I think for everybody else in the room. I'm still in digestion mode. I have a sort of a data overflow, but I'm very happy that I've been here because there was very relevant and very high quality discussions and contributions. And so that's also already my second point. Thank you to everybody here, particularly Klaus, but also Nira and Atsala and everybody else. I cannot mention Stefan, of course, and the F20 team. And the third thing I like to mention is when I was looking at all of this, it seemed to me that we needed to actively nudge or create a new paradigm. Because if you think about industry, everybody says industry 4.0, right? But we are already in 5.0 actually. 4.0 is the past, digitalization, okay, important, but it's not really solving the problem. But we need to decarbonize the industry, not just the financial part, but the whole thing. And that will lead us to a new economy, which is not a digital economy, but it's the net zero economy. So I think if we can together successfully convince academicians and writers, governments to embrace this new paradigm, I think it would make a whole lot of difference. So that's just some thought points. Thank you. And I give it to Klaus. And sorry, one more thing. Are you still there in Jakarta? No? Maybe they went home already. Okay. So give it to Klaus.
Thank you very much, Ilham. Thank you very much, Nira and Vatsala. And thank you to all of you to participate so long. It was really a long day, full fruit for all of us, and I hope encouragement. I have 3 points to raise here. One is recommendations of F20. Now there is a starting point. It's not a finishing point with the recommendations. Now we have to take them and bring it to the tables of the leaders of the G20, the finance ministers and the central bank leaders. That is what we do now up to the 9th and 10th of September, when there will be the summit, the G20 summit here in Delhi. And that is always the case, that the foundations take the recommendations in their specific countries to their specific leaders. And that makes a difference. If it comes from Hamburg or so, it must be delivered in ownership of those foundations from these specific countries. And then after the 9th and 10th of September, we have to continue with the recommendations because the time of the presidency of India is up to the 30th of November. And then, that is my second point, we have to welcome Brazil. And we had wonderful Alice there on the screen, and there is readiness in Brazil to take over. But in that time, when we are deeply working with the Brazilians, we will never forget the contact with you, wonderful Dasra and wonderful Shakti and all the other foundations and groupings of foundations here in India. That was the same case with you, that we continue. That is so important, not to say, no, it's over somehow. We need continuity, we need trust, and now there is a trust, and on trust we can build. I think that is really wonderful. And my last point is a huge thank you to those who made it possible, what we have done today, the techniques of applause for all those who made it possible to get the contact with those who were outside. A wonderful thank you to our moderator. You did a wonderful job. That was really so great. And all those who were active supporting that we could meet here and that we could meet from here to the world, because many were looking on the live stream from many different parts on a global scale. And what's important, the live stream can be, that is recorded, and it can be reviewed many times, not only once, many times, because there's so hard stuff in it, what we discussed today. And a big thank you now also to Anna and to Karina. Anna is there and Karina is here. They are wonderful support for F20 for a long time. We started in Milano when I recognized it well with the first high-level event. And it was a pleasure to work with you. Now we will change a little bit your activities with others, but still in the field of foundations and sustainability. That is great. And a huge thank you to you, my dear friend Stefan. That was well done. And it was embarrassing for me what you prepared today. And I must say, I don't step down. It's more, I have to reduce my activities very much because of health reasons. And I'm there, I'm helping also in future. And I think we could do a lot. And together with you, we can really make a difference. And that is so encouraging also for me. And I think also for all of you. Thank you for coming, and bye-bye. And a good summit in September.